The summer of 1305 finds William Wallace crouched in the dense undergrowth of a Scottish forest, his once proud frame now gaunt from years of constant flight. The man who once commanded armies and negotiated with kings now lives like a hunted animal, moving from shadow to shadow across a homeland that no longer recognizes his authority. His weathered hands, scarred from countless battles, grip a simple dirk, the only weapon left to Scotland's former guardian. 7 years have passed since Wallace first raised his sword against English tyranny, and the weight of those years shows in every line of his face. The idealistic young nobleman who once believed in the righteousness of his cause has been replaced by a hardened fugitive who understands the brutal mathematics of survival. Every rustle of leaves could herald his death. Every stranger's face might mask an English spy or Scottish collaborator eager to claim the massive bounty on his head. King Edward I, the Hammer of the Scots, has placed a price of £100 on Wallace's capture, a fortune that could feed a family for decades. More dangerous than the gold, however, is the network of informants that Edward has cultivated throughout Scotland. Former allies, broken nobles, and desperate commoners all serve as the king's eyes and ears, transforming Wallace's own countrymen into his greatest threat. The irony cuts deeper than any blade. The man who once united Scotland against foreign oppression now finds himself betrayed by the very people he fought to liberate. The Scottish nobility, once divided between English and Scottish loyalties, have largely submitted to Edward's rule. They have bent the knee, sworn new oaths, and accepted English lordship in exchange for the preservation of their lands and lives. In this new Scotland, William Wallace represents not hope, but dangerous defiance, a reminder of failed rebellion that threatens the fragile peace they have purchased with their honour. As Wallace moves through the forest, he carries with him not just the burden of his own survival, but the crushing weight of a nation's abandoned dreams. The resistance that once burned bright across Scotland has been systematically extinguished, its leaders dead, exiled, or turned. He is the last ember of a fire that once threatened to consume English rule, and Edward I will not rest until that ember is finally snuffed out. The hunter has indeed become the hunted, and in the gathering darkness of this Scottish summer, the net is closing with inexorable precision. William Wallace was never meant to be a revolutionary. Born around 1270 into the minor nobility of Renfrewshire, he was the younger son of a family that held modest lands and harboured modest ambitions. His father, Alan Wallace, served as a vassal to James Stuart, the High Steward of Scotland, and young William seemed destined for a life of quiet service to his feudal superiors. The boy who would become Scotland's greatest hero received his education at Paisley Abbey, where monks taught him Latin, theology, and the arts of reading and writing, skills that would later prove invaluable in his diplomatic missions. But Scotland in the late 13th century was a powder keg waiting for a spark. The death of King Alexander III in 1286, followed by the tragic demise of his heir Margaret, the Maid of Norway, in 1290, had plunged the kingdom into a succession crisis that would reshape the destiny of every Scotsman. When the Scottish nobles invited Edward I to arbitrate between the competing claims of John Balliol and Robert Bruce, they unknowingly handed their independence to a king who viewed Scotland not as a sovereign nation, but as a rebellious province to be brought to heel. Edward's choice of John Balliol as king proved to be a calculated humiliation. Balliol, derisively nicknamed Tomb Tabard, or Empty Coat by his own subjects, was reduced to a puppet ruler whose every decision required English approval. When Balliol finally attempted to assert Scottish independence by forming an alliance with France in 1295, Edward's response was swift and merciless. The English army that invaded Scotland in 1296 was not merely conquering territory, it was systematically destroying a nation's will to resist. The sack of Berwick in March 1296 announced Edward's intentions with horrifying clarity. For 3 days, English soldiers butchered the inhabitants of Scotland's most prosperous town, sparing neither women nor children. Contemporary chroniclers reported that the streets ran red with blood, and the stench of decomposing corpses lingered for months. This was not warfare. It was terrorism, designed to break Scottish resistance before it could properly form. For young William Wallace, the transformation from minor nobleman to revolutionary leader began with personal tragedy. While the exact details remain shrouded in historical uncertainty, it appears that English soldiers killed his father and elder brother, leaving William as the head of a family that had lost everything to foreign occupation. The comfortable world of feudal obligation and peaceful service had been shattered, replaced by a harsh reality where survival itself required resistance. Wallace's emergence as a leader of the Scottish resistance was as unexpected as it was meteoric. Unlike the great nobles who commanded through birthright and vast estates, Wallace led through force of personality and unwavering conviction. His first recorded act of defiance, the killing of William Heselrigg, Sheriff of Lanark, in May 1297, was both personal revenge and political statement. Heselrigg had report. Edley murdered Wallace's beloved Marion Braidfute, and Wallace's response demonstrated that English officials were not untouchable, even in the heart of occupied Scotland. The young man who had once studied theology now found himself studying the arts of war and statecraft. Wallace possessed an intuitive understanding of guerrilla tactics, using Scotland's difficult terrain to offset English advantages in heavy cavalry and siege equipment. More importantly, he understood that successful rebellion required more than military victories. It demanded the creation of a new political order that could command the loyalty of common Scotsmen who had been abandoned by their traditional leaders. When the Scottish nobles elected Wallace as Guardian of Scotland, following his stunning victory at Stirling Bridge in September 1297, they were acknowledging a fundamental shift in Scottish society. For the first time in the nation's history, a man of relatively humble origins had risen to supreme power through merit rather than birth. Wallace's guardianship represented not just resistance to English rule, but a revolution in Scottish political consciousness that would outlive the man himself. The euphoria of Stirling Bridge could not last forever, and William Wallace understood better than most that military victories meant nothing without political consolidation. As Guardian of Scotland, he faced the impossible task of uniting a fractured nation while simultaneously defending it against the most powerful military machine in medieval Europe. The Scottish nobility, many of whom had initially supported his rise, began to view his radical policies with growing alarm. Wallace's attempts to create a truly national government, drawing authority from the common people rather than feudal hierarchy, threatened the very foundations of medieval society. His diplomatic missions to France and Rome, seeking international recognition for Scottish independence, bypassed traditional noble prerogatives and established dangerous precedents. When he imposed taxes to fund the resistance and demanded military service from all able-bodied Scotsmen regardless of social rank, he was essentially creating a modern state, centuries before its time. The disaster at Falkirk, on July the 22nd, 1298, shattered more than just the Scottish army. It destroyed the myth of Wallace's invincibility and exposed the fatal weaknesses in his coalition. Edward I had learned from his humiliation at Stirling Bridge, and the English army that faced Wallace at Falkirk was a perfectly coordinated killing machine. The Scottish nobles, commanded by John Comyn and Robert Bruce, withdrew their heavy cavalry at the crucial moment, leaving Wallace's infantry formations exposed to devastating English archery and cavalry charges. Whether the noble withdrawal was treachery or tactical necessity remains debated by historians, but its effect was undeniable. The schiltrons of Scottish spearmen, which had proven so effective against cavalry at Stirling Bridge, became death traps when subjected to concentrated arrow fire. Wallace watched helplessly as his army disintegrated, taking with it the lives of thousands of common Scotsmen who had believed in his vision of independence. The psychological impact of Falkirk extended far beyond the battlefield. Wallace's resignation as Guardian immediately following the defeat was both an acknowledgement of military failure and a recognition that his political coalition had collapsed. The Scottish nobles, who had reluctantly accepted his leadership, now openly questioned his competence, and many began to explore accommodation with English rule as a preferable alternative to continued resistance. Wallace's subsequent diplomatic mission to France in 1299 was both a strategic necessity and a form of political exile. While he negotiated with King Philip IV for military support and sought papal intervention on Scotland's behalf, his former allies at home were already beginning the process of surrender. The submission of Scottish nobles accelerated throughout 1300 and 1301, as Edward I offered generous terms to those willing to abandon the cause of independence. The man who returned to Scotland in 1301 found a country transformed by defeat and demoralization. The network of supporters who had once provided intelligence, supplies, and safe houses had largely evaporated. Former allies crossed the street to avoid acknowledging him, and the common people who had once cheered his name now feared that association with the former Guardian would bring English retribution upon their families. Wallace's attempts to rebuild the resistance from this foundation of despair revealed both his extraordinary determination and his growing isolation from political reality. The guerrilla campaign he launched in 1303 achieved tactical successes but could not address the fundamental problem. Scotland had lost the will to fight. The nobility had made their peace with English rule, the Church had submitted to Edward's authority, and the common people were exhausted by years of warfare and economic devastation. By 1304, Wallace commanded perhaps a few hundred loyal followers in a country of nearly 500,000 inhabitants. His continued defiance, once seen as heroic leadership, was now viewed by many Scots as dangerous fanaticism that prolonged their suffering. The transformation was complete. The guardian who had once embodied Scotland's hopes had become a fugitive whose very existence threatened the fragile stability that his countrymen desperately craved. Edward IV's campaign to eliminate William Wallace was a masterpiece of medieval intelligence warfare, combining systematic brutality with sophisticated psychological manipulation. The English king understood that capturing Wallace required more than military force. It demanded the complete destruction of the social networks that had sustained the Scottish resistance. Every Scotsman who had ever aided Wallace became a potential target, and every potential target became a potential informant. The king's strategy began with a comprehensive mapping of Wallace's known associates, supporters, and hiding places. English administrators compiled detailed lists of Scottish families who had provided aid to the resistance, creating a database of potential collaborators that would make modern intelligence agencies envious. These lists became tools of both punishment and recruitment, as Edward offered pardons to those willing to provide information while threatening execution for continued defiance. The role of Scottish collaborators in hunting Wallace cannot be understated. Men like John de Menteith, who would ultimately betray Wallace, were not simply opportunistic traitors. They were products of a systematic campaign to turn Scottish society against its former hero. Edward I understood that Wallace's capture by English soldiers would create a martyr, but his betrayal by fellow Scots would demonstrate the futility of resistance and the wisdom of submission. The psychological pressure on potential collaborators was immense. Scottish nobles who had submitted to English rule found their loyalty constantly questioned and their positions perpetually insecure. Providing information about Wallace became a way to prove their commitment to the new order, while failure to cooperate raised suspicions about their true allegiances. Edward I had created a system where betraying Wallace was not just profitable, it was necessary for survival. Wallace's own behavior during this period reveals a man increasingly consumed by paranoia and desperation. Contemporary accounts describe him as suspicious of even his closest allies, constantly changing his location and identity. The psychological toll of years as a fugitive had transformed the confident leader who once commanded armies into a haunted figure who trusted no one completely. The intelligence networks pursuing Wallace operated with remarkable sophistication for the medieval period. English agents infiltrated Scottish communities, posing as merchants, pilgrims, and even resistance sympathizers. They established safe houses and communication networks that allowed rapid transmission of information about Wallace's movements. When Wallace appeared in a particular region, English forces could be alerted and deployed within days. The systematic nature of the pursuit is evident in surviving English administrative records, which detail payments to informants, rewards for information, and expenses for maintaining surveillance operations. Edward I was spending enormous sums, equivalent to millions of modern pounds, on the single objective of capturing one man. This investment reflected not just personal animosity, but a clear understanding that Wallace's continued freedom represented an existential threat to English rule in Scotland. Wallace's attempts to evade capture reveal both his tactical intelligence and his growing desperation. He adopted multiple identities, traveled in small groups, and avoided his known associates. He moved constantly between the highlands and lowlands, never staying in one location for more than a few days. Yet each movement left traces that skilled trackers could follow, and each contact with potential supporters created new opportunities for betrayal. The psychological warfare extended beyond Wallace himself to his remaining supporters. English forces conducted brutal raids on communities suspected of harboring the fugitive, employing collective punishment to discourage assistance. Entire villages were burned, livestock slaughtered, and inhabitants tortured for information. The message was clear. Helping Wallace brought not honor, but destruction. By the summer of 1305, the net had tightened to the point where Wallace's capture seemed inevitable. His options for safe haven had dwindled to a handful of remote locations, and even these were compromised by the extensive intelligence network arrayed against him. The man who had once moved freely across Scotland now found himself trapped in an ever-shrinking circle of surveillance and betrayal. The stage was set for the final act of this deadly game of cat and mouse, and both hunter and hunted understood that the end was approaching with inexorable certainty. John de Menteith was a man caught between worlds, and his internal torment would ultimately seal William Wallace's fate. As a Scottish noble who had submitted to English rule, Menteith embodied the impossible choices facing his entire class in the aftermath of Scotland's defeat. His family had served Scottish kings for generations, but the realities of English occupation demanded new loyalties and painful compromises. Menteith's relationship with Wallace was complex and deeply personal. They had known each other since childhood, moving in the same circles of minor Scottish nobility before the wars transformed their world. When Wallace rose to prominence as Guardian of Scotland, Menteith had initially supported the resistance, providing intelligence and safe passage through his territories. The bonds between them were forged not just by political alliance, but by shared memories of a Scotland that no longer exports. Instead, the transformation of Menteith from ally to betrayer was gradual and agonizing. Following the collapse of organized Scottish resistance, he faced the same stark choice confronting every Scottish noble: submit to English rule or face the destruction of his family and estates. Unlike Wallace, who chose exile and continued resistance, Menteith chose survival and accommodation. His submission to Edward I in 1304 was accompanied by oaths of loyalty that bound him not just politically but morally to the English cause. Edward I's genius lay in understanding that Menteith's submission was incomplete as long as Wallace remained free. The former Guardian's continued defiance was a constant reminder of Menteith's own capitulation, and his very existence called into question the legitimacy of the new order that Menteith had accepted. The English king began applying subtle but relentless pressure, making it clear that Menteith's position depended not just on his own loyalty, but on his active contribution to eliminating the last vestiges of Scottish resistance. The specific circumstances that brought Wallace into Menteith's power remain shrouded in historical uncertainty, but the broad outlines are clear. In the summer of 1305, Wallace was desperately seeking safe passage to the continent, where he hoped to continue his diplomatic efforts on Scotland's behalf. His network of supporters had been systematically destroyed, leaving him dependent on contacts whose loyalty was increasingly questionable. Menteith's castle at Dumbarton controlled one of the few remaining routes by which Wallace might escape Scotland. When Wallace approached him for assistance, Menteith faced the defining moment of his life. He could honor their old friendship and risk everything he had preserved through submission, or he could seize the opportunity to prove his loyalty to Edward I beyond any possible doubt. The psychological dynamics of their final meeting can only be imagined, but contemporary accounts suggest that Wallace trusted Menteith completely. The former Guardian, exhausted by years of flight and betrayal, may have seen in his old friend a last connection to the Scotland they had both served. Menteith, for his part, was reportedly tormented by what he was about to do, but the logic of his position left him no alternative. The betrayal itself was carefully orchestrated to minimize the risk of Wallace's escape or rescue. Menteith had secretly coordinated with English forces, ensuring that soldiers would be positioned to intercept Wallace once he was in custody. The timing was crucial. Wallace had to be lulled into a sense of security before the trap could be sprung. When Wallace arrived at Robroyston near Glasgow on August 3, 1305, he believed he was meeting with an ally who would help him escape Scotland. Instead, he was walking into a carefully prepared ambush that would end his 7-year flight from English justice. Menteith's men, acting on their lord's orders, surrounded the building where Wallace was staying and took him prisoner without a fight. The moment of Wallace's realization that he had been betrayed by a trusted friend represents one of the most psychologically devastating scenes in Scottish history. The man who had survived countless battles and evaded capture for years was finally brought down not by English military superiority, but by the treachery of his own countrymen. The look that passed between Wallace and Menteith in that moment encapsulated the tragedy of a nation that had been forced to devour its own heroes. Menteith's reward for this service was substantial. Edward thus granted him additional lands and confirmed his position as a trusted administrator of occupied Scotland. Yet contemporary accounts suggest that Menteith found little satisfaction in his 30 pieces of silver. The man who had preserved his family's position through betrayal would spend the remainder of his life haunted by the knowledge that he had destroyed the last hope of Scottish independence with his own hands. The psychological complexity of the betrayal extended beyond the personal relationship between Wallace and Menteith to encompass the broader tragedy of Scottish society under English occupation. Menteith was not a villain in any simple sense. He was a man who had made an impossible choice in impossible circumstances. His betrayal of Wallace was simultaneously an act of personal treachery and a rational response to political reality. Wallace's capture at Robroyston was not just the end of his personal freedom, it was the symbolic death of Scottish resistance itself. The man who had once united a nation in defiance of foreign rule was brought down by the very divisions that English occupation had created within Scottish society. The betrayal revealed the extent to which Edward VI had succeeded in turning Scots against each other, making continued resistance not just difficult, but psychologically impossible. The irony was complete. Scotland's greatest hero had been destroyed not by English strength, but by Scottish weakness. The nation that had once rallied to Wallace's banner had been so thoroughly broken that its own sons were willing to sell their former champion for the promise of security under foreign rule. The morning of August 3rd, 1305, dawned grey and misty over the small manor house at Robroyston, near Glasgow, where William Wallace had spent what would prove to be his last night of freedom. The former guardian of Scotland had arrived the previous evening, believing he was meeting with allies who would help him escape to the continent. Instead, he had walked into a carefully orchestrated trap that would end his 7-year flight from English justice and extinguish the last flame of organised Scottish resistance. Wallace awoke to find himself surrounded by armed men, bearing the colours of John de Menteith. The realisation of betrayal struck him with devastating force. Not just the tactical understanding that he had been captured, but the profound psychological blow of discovering that his own countrymen had sold him to his enemies. Contemporary accounts describe a moment of stunned silence as Wallace comprehended the full scope of his situation, followed by a dignity in defeat that impressed even his captors. The physical act of taking Wallace prisoner was almost anticlimactic after years of dramatic pursuit. There was no heroic last stand, no desperate fight against overwhelming odds. The man who had once commanded armies and struck terror into English hearts submitted to capture with the quiet resignation of someone who had always known this moment would come. His weapons were removed, his hands bound, and the transformation from legendary hero to common prisoner was complete in a matter of minutes. Menteith's men treated their captive with a mixture of respect and fear that reflected Wallace's complex status in Scottish society. He was simultaneously a traitor to be delivered to English justice and a former guardian whose authority they had once acknowledged. The psychological tension was palpable as Scottish soldiers prepared to hand over their nation's greatest hero to foreign executioners. News of Wallace's capture spread across Scotland with the speed of wildfire, and the reaction was immediate and devastating. In castles and cottages, in monasteries and marketplaces, Scots received the news with a mixture of shock, despair, and resignation. The man who had embodied their hopes for independence was finally in English hands, and with him died the last pretence that Scottish resistance could succeed. The psychological impact on the Scottish people cannot be overstated. Wallace had represented more than military leadership. He had been the living symbol of Scottish defiance, the proof that their nation could stand against English tyranny. His capture demonstrated conclusively that resistance was futile, that Edward I's power was absolute, and that Scotland's independence was nothing more than a dangerous dream. For Edward I, news of Wallace's capture represented the culmination of 8 years of systematic warfare against Scottish independence. The English king had invested enormous resources in hunting down this single man, understanding that Wallace's continued freedom represented an existential threat to English rule in Scotland. His capture was not just a tactical victory, it was the final proof that English authority in Scotland was absolute and unchallengeable. The immediate aftermath of the capture revealed the thoroughness of English planning. Within hours, Wallace was transferred to English custody and began the journey south toward London and his inevitable trial. The speed and efficiency of these arrangements demonstrated that Edward had been preparing for this moment for years, with detailed plans for Wallace's transport, trial, and execution already in place. Scottish nobles who had submitted to English rule received the news with complex emotions. Many felt genuine sorrow at the fate of a man they had once followed, but their grief was tempered by relief that the last obstacle to stable English rule had been removed. Wallace's capture meant that their own submissions would no longer be questioned, that their accommodation with English authority was now the only viable path forward. The common people of Scotland experienced the news as a form of collective bereavement. Wallace had been their champion, the man who had risen from their own ranks to challenge kings and nobles. His capture represented not just personal tragedy, but the death of their dreams for a better future. The Scotland that emerged from August 3rd, 1305, was a fundamentally different nation, one that had learned to accept subjugation as the price of survival. In the broader context of medieval European politics, Wallace's capture marked the effective end of Scottish independence for a generation. Edward I had succeeded where previous English kings had failed, not just in conquering Scottish territory, but in breaking the Scottish will to resist. The capture at Robroyston was the moment when Scotland ceased to be a sovereign nation and became merely a rebellious province of the English crown. The symbolic significance of the betrayal extended far beyond its immediate political consequences. Wallace's capture by fellow Scots demonstrated that Edward had achieved something more devastating than military victory. He had turned Scottish society against itself, making heroes into traitors and patriots into collaborators. This was the true genius of English policy, not just defeating Scottish resistance, but making it psychologically impossible to sustain. As Wallace was led away from Robroyston in chains, he carried with him not just his own fate, but the hope. As in dreams of an entire nation, Scotland's darkest hour had arrived, and the shadows would not lift for many years to come. The immediate aftermath of William Wallace's capture sent shockwaves throughout Scotland that reverberated far beyond the political sphere. Within days of the betrayal at Robroyston, the last organised pockets of Scottish resistance began to collapse, as news spread that their ultimate leader had fallen into English hands. The psychological impact was devastating. If Wallace, the most resourceful and determined of Scottish patriots, could be brought down by treachery, what hope remained for lesser men? The Scottish nobles who had maintained precarious neutrality or covert support for the resistance now rushed to demonstrate their loyalty to Edward III with unseemly haste. Sir John Comyn, who had once served alongside Wallace as Guardian of Scotland, publicly reaffirmed his submission to English rule and offered his services in hunting down any remaining rebels. Robert Bruce, whose own ambitions for the Scottish throne had been temporarily shelved, made elaborate displays of loyalty to the English crown, even as he privately calculated the implications of Wallace's downfall for his own future plans. The speed with which former allies abandoned Wallace's cause revealed the extent to which fear had replaced hope as the dominant emotion in Scottish political life. Men who had once spoken privately of independence now competed to denounce their former beliefs most convincingly. The transformation was so complete that within weeks of Wallace's capture, it became dangerous even to speak his name in anything other than condemnatory terms. Edward III's propaganda machine moved swiftly to exploit the psychological victory. Royal proclamations declared that Wallace's capture proved the futility of resistance and the wisdom of submission to English rule. The king's scribes crafted carefully worded documents that portrayed the betrayal not as treachery, but as patriotic duty. Scottish nobles fulfilling their obligation to deliver a dangerous criminal to justice. This narrative inversion was crucial to Edward's long-term strategy of legitimizing English rule through Scottish collaboration. The journey from Robroyston to London became a carefully orchestrated display of English power and Scottish submission. Wallace was transported in chains through the heart of Scotland, allowing English officials to demonstrate their complete control over the country. At each stop, local Scottish authorities were required to provide provisions and security, forcing them to participate actively in their former hero's humiliation. The treatment of Wallace during this journey reflected Edward I's sophisticated understanding of political theatre. The prisoner was kept alive and relatively unharmed, not out of mercy, but because his public trial and execution in London would provide maximum propaganda value. Wallace's suffering was to be displayed before the largest possible audience, serving as both entertainment for English crowds and warning to potential Scottish rebels. International reaction to Wallace's capture was muted but significant. The French court, which had provided diplomatic support to Scottish independence, quietly abandoned any pretense of intervention on Scotland's behalf. Pope Clement V, who had previously issued bulls supporting Scottish sovereignty, maintained diplomatic silence that effectively endorsed English claims to suzerainty over Scotland. Wallace's capture had not only ended Scottish resistance, it had isolated Scotland diplomatically, leaving the country without foreign allies or support. The psychological impact on the Scottish people was perhaps most evident in the complete absence of rescue attempts. Wallace had once commanded the loyalty of thousands of common Scots who would have risked their lives to free him. Now, his journey to London proceeded without a single serious attempt at liberation. The network of supporters who had sustained him during 7 years of resistance had simply evaporated. dissolved by fear and despair. The collapse of Scottish morale was so complete that English administrators began reducing their military presence in the country. Garrisons that had been maintained at full strength throughout the years of resistance were scaled back as it became clear that the threat of rebellion had effectively ended. The Scotland of late 1305 was a pacified province that required occupation rather than conquest. Perhaps most tragically, Wallace's capture marked the beginning of a systematic effort to erase his memory from Scottish consciousness. English authorities banned songs, stories, and poems that celebrated his achievements, while promoting alternative narratives that portrayed him as a dangerous outlaw whose capture had restored peace to Scotland. The man who had once been Scotland's greatest hero was being transformed into a cautionary tale about the dangers of defying legitimate authority. The few Scots who maintained private loyalty to Wallace's memory found themselves increasingly isolated and vulnerable. To speak positively of the former guardian became an act of sedition that could result in imprisonment or death. The Scotland that had once celebrated Wallace's victories now lived in terror of being associated with his name. The betrayal at Robroyston had achieved something that years of English military campaigns had failed to accomplish. It had broken the Scottish spirit so completely that resistance became not just impossible, but unthinkable. Edward had won not just a military victory, but a psychological triumph that would shape Scottish consciousness for generations to come. The capture of William Wallace marked a fundamental turning point in Scottish history, but its significance extended far beyond the immediate political consequences. In the years that followed, as Scotland struggled to rebuild its identity under English rule, the true cost of Wallace's heroism became increasingly apparent. His sacrifice had not been in vain, but neither had it achieved the immediate liberation for which he had fought so desperately. The transformation of Wallace from living leader to martyred symbol began even before his execution in London. As news of his capture spread throughout Europe, chroniclers and poets began crafting narratives that emphasized his moral courage rather than his military failures. The man who had been defeated on the battlefield was reborn in popular imagination as a figure of uncompromising principle who had chosen death over dishonor. This mythologization process was crucial to Wallace's ultimate historical impact. While his military campaigns had failed to secure Scottish independence, his moral example provided a template for future resistance that would prove far more durable than any tactical victory. The idea that a man of humble origins could challenge kings and empires through force of will alone became a powerful inspiration for subsequent generations of Scottish patriots. The immediate aftermath of Wallace's capture seemed to confirm Edward V's complete victory over Scottish nationalism. For nearly a year following the betrayal at Robroyston, Scotland remained quiescent under English rule. The nobility had submitted, the church had accommodated itself to foreign authority, and the common people had accepted their subjugation as the price of peace. Yet beneath this surface calm, Wallace's example was already beginning to work its transformative magic. Robert Bruce's decision to claim the Scottish throne in 1306 was directly influenced by Wallace's legacy. Bruce had witnessed firsthand the consequences of half-hearted resistance and noble collaboration. Wallace's fate demonstrated that there could be no middle ground between independence and subjugation, a lesson that would shape Bruce's own approach to leadership. When Bruce finally committed himself to the cause of Scottish independence, he did so with the understanding that failure would mean not just political defeat, but personal destruction. The psychological impact of Wallace's sacrifice on Scottish consciousness cannot be measured in purely political terms. His willingness to endure years of exile, betrayal, and ultimately death for the principle of Scottish independence created a moral standard that subsequent leaders felt compelled to meet. The man who had been abandoned by his contemporaries became the inspiration for a new generation of patriots who understood that true leadership required absolute commitment. The irony of Wallace's historical position is that his greatest victory came through his most complete defeat. The capture at Robroyston, which seemed to mark the end of Scottish resistance, actually provided the moral foundation for its eventual renewal. Bruce's successful campaign for Scottish independence drew its legitimacy not from noble bloodlines or feudal obligations, but from the democratic nationalism that Wallace had pioneered. The long-term consequences of Wallace's heroism extended beyond Scotland to influence the development of national consciousness throughout medieval Europe. His example demonstrated that resistance to foreign rule could be morally justified even when it was militarily hopeless. This principle would inspire liberation movements for centuries to come, making Wallace a figure of international as well as national significance. The price of Wallace's heroism was paid not just by the man himself, but by the entire Scottish nation. His uncompromising stance had prolonged a conflict that brought enormous suffering to the Scottish people, yet it had also preserved the idea of Scottish independence during the darkest period in the nation's history. Without Wallace's sacrifice, the Scotland that eventually emerged under Robert Bruce might never have existed. The transformation of Wallace from failed military leader to successful moral exemplar reveals the complex relationship between immediate political consequences and long-term historical significance. His capture marked the end of one phase of Scottish resistance, but it also provided the inspiration for a more successful phase that would ultimately achieve the independence he had died seeking. Modern historians recognize that Wallace's true achievement lay not in his military victories or diplomatic initiatives, but in his creation of a new model of Scottish leadership based on popular sovereignty rather than feudal hierarchy. This democratic nationalism, forged in the crucible of defeat and betrayal, would prove to be his most enduring legacy. The Scotland that celebrated its independence under Robert Bruce was fundamentally different from the Scotland that had existed before Wallace's rebellion. It was a nation that had learned to value principle over pragmatism, moral courage over political calculation, and national entity over feudal loyalty. These lessons, purchased with Wallace's blood, would shape Scottish consciousness for centuries to come. The story of William Wallace's capture at Robroyston transcends its immediate historical context to illuminate timeless truths about leadership, loyalty, and the price of unwavering principle. In an age when political compromise and pragmatic accommodation are often celebrated as virtues, Wallace's uncompromising stance offers a different model of moral courage that remains profoundly relevant to contemporary audiences. The betrayal that brought down Scotland's greatest hero reveals the corrosive effects of foreign occupation on national character. When a people are forced to choose between survival and principle, the temptation to rationalize collaboration becomes overwhelming. John de Menteith was not a monster. He was a man who made the same choice that most of us would make when faced with the destruction of everything we hold dear. His tragedy lies not in his moral failure, but in the impossible circumstances that made such failure inevitable. Wallace's refusal to accept these same impossible circumstances speaks to a different understanding of human dignity and national identity. His willingness to endure exile, poverty, and ultimately death, rather than submit to foreign rule, was not the product of fanaticism, but of a clear-eyed recognition that some principles are worth more than life itself. This moral clarity, rare in any age, becomes even more remarkable when viewed against the backdrop of medieval political culture, where personal loyalty and feudal obligation typically trumped abstract principles. The psychological dynamics of Wallace's final years offer profound insights into the nature of principled leadership in desperate circumstances. As his political support evaporated and his military options disappeared, Wallace faced the fundamental choice that confronts all moral leaders: abandon the cause to preserve the man, or sacrifice the man to preserve the cause. His decision to continue fighting even when victory was impossible demonstrates a form of courage that transcends tactical calculation. The modern world, with its emphasis on pragmatic politics and negotiated settlements, often struggles to understand figures like Wallace, who refuse to accept the logic of compromise. Yet his example suggests that there are moments in history when compromise becomes complicity, when accommodation enables oppression, and when the only moral response is absolute resistance. These moments are rare, but they define the character of nations and individuals in ways that more comfortable choices cannot. Wallace's legacy also illuminates the complex relationship between individual sacrifice and collective achievement. His personal failure to liberate Scotland was transformed into the moral foundation for Scotland's eventual success under Robert Bruce. This transformation suggests that the impact of principled leadership cannot be measured solely in immediate political terms. Sometimes the greatest victories are achieved by those who do not live to see them. The betrayal at Robroyston serves as a cautionary tale about the fragility of human loyalty under extreme pressure. The Scottish nobles who abandoned Wallace were not inherently treacherous. They were ordinary men who found themselves in extraordinary circumstances that tested their moral courage beyond its limits. Their failure reminds us that heroism is not a common virtue, and that societies which depend on heroic leadership for their survival are inherently vulnerable. Yet Wallace's story also demonstrates the transformative power of moral example. His willingness to sacrifice everything for Scottish independence created a standard of leadership that inspired future generations to achieve what he could not. The Scotland that eventually won its freedom under Robert Bruce was shaped by Wallace's vision of what a free nation could become, even though he never lived to see that vision realized. The enduring fascination with Wallace's story reflects humanity's deep need for heroes who embody absolute moral commitment. In a world where political leaders routinely sacrifice principle for expediency, Wallace represents an alternative model of leadership based on unwavering dedication to transcendent values. His example suggests that true leadership sometimes requires the courage to fail magnificently rather than succeed through compromise. The capture at Robroyston also reveals the devastating psychological effects of prolonged resistance on both leaders and followers. Wallace's final years as a hunted fugitive demonstrate the personal cost of uncompromising leadership, the isolation, paranoia, and gradual erosion of human connections that accompany absolute dedication to a cause. His story serves as a reminder that heroism exacts a terrible price from those who choose to pay it. Perhaps most importantly, Wallace's fate illustrates the fundamental truth that moral victories and political victories operate according to different timelines. His immediate political failure was complete. Scotland remained under English rule, his supporters were scattered or dead, and his own life ended in brutal execution. Yet his moral victory was equally complete, providing the inspiration and legitimacy that would eventually enable Scottish independence. The lessons of Wallace's capture extend beyond questions of national liberation to encompass broader themes of human dignity and moral courage. His refusal to accept subjugation, even when resistance seemed hopeless, affirms the fundamental principle that some values transcend practical calculation. In an age when cynicism often masquerades as wisdom, Wallace's example reminds us that idealism, however costly, remains essential to human progress. The darkness that descended on Scotland following Wallace's betrayal was not permanent, but it was necessary. Sometimes nations, like individuals, must experience complete defeat before they can discover the moral resources necessary for ultimate victory. Wallace's sacrifice provided Scotland with the moral clarity that had been lacking during the confused years of noble rivalry and political compromise. His story continues to resonate because it addresses the eternal human struggle between security and freedom, between survival and principle, between the possible and the necessary. William Wallace chose the harder path at every crucial moment, and while that choice led to his destruction, it also ensured his immortality. In the end, the man who lost everything won everything that truly mattered, the right to be remembered as someone who refused to surrender his soul for the promise of safety. The capture of William Wallace at Robroyston marked Scotland's darkest hour, but it also planted the seeds of Scotland's eventual redemption. In the terrible mathematics of history, his defeat was the price of his nation's ultimate victory, his betrayal the foundation of his eternal glory. The darkness was real, but it was not final, and in that truth lies the enduring power of his extraordinary life.